Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep, really deep, into what makes human societies tick. What drives us to cooperate or to compete, or, let's be honest, sometimes do a bit of both.
It's a fascinating puzzle, isn't it? How do we go from individual motivations to these incredibly complex social structures, these civilizations we've built?
And luckily for this deep dive, we've got a mountain of fascinating material to draw from. Cutting-edge research from evolutionary biology and economics to anthropology, even political science, all trying to make sense of us.
We've got some great thinkers to grapple with, too, like Prince Peter Kropotkin, who saw mutual aid as a fundamental driver of human evolution.
And of course, you can't talk about the origins of society without bumping into Thomas Hobbes and his rather, shall we say, less rosy view of the state of nature as a war of all against all.
So right from the start, we've got these two contrasting lenses to look through, cooperation versus self-interest. It's a great place to begin, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it raises this, well, almost a paradox, right? How can we have both cooperation and this, let's face it, pretty pervasive self-interest at play? The idea of selfish genes almost sounds like it should lead to everyone just looking out for number one all the time. But our sources suggest it's not so simple.
Well, think about it this way. Even seemingly selfless acts, those things we do to help others, especially family, can be understood through the lens of, well, genetic survival. It's not about conscious altruism necessarily, but about genes promoting behaviors that, well, help copies of those same genes survive and spread.
So, like risking your own neck to save a sibling because you share a lot of the same DNA, it looks selfless on the surface, but deep down, those genes are looking after their own, so to speak.
Exactly. It's a fascinating perspective, isn't it? And then we've got Haig's work, which throws a real wrench in the idea of pure harmony, even in the closest of biological relationships.
Yeah, that stuff about conflict between a mother and her child, even in the womb, really makes you think. Genes in the fetus might drive it to take more from the mother than is ideal for her long-term health, even her future reproductive success. It's like there's this underlying competition, even where we might expect perfect cooperation.
A powerful reminder that even in seemingly unified systems, there can be these competing demands at play. And this, of course, brings us to public choice theory, which doesn't exactly paint the most flattering picture of those in public service.
Yeah, no rose-tinted glasses there. Public choice theory basically says that even politicians, bureaucrats, heck, even voters, are primarily motivated by their own self-interest, their own gain.
It's a sobering counterpoint to the idealized view of selfless public servants, wouldn't you say? Forces us to look at the motivations behind policy decisions through a more, well, realistic lens.
It's like a timeless observation, really. That fable of Menenius Agrippa used to calm down the plebeians in ancient Rome, remember? It compares society to a body, with the different parts needing each other, even if the comparison to the ruling class might have been a tad self-serving on their part.
But the core idea that different parts of a society, even with their own interests, are ultimately interdependent is quite insightful. Even in the pursuit of self-interest, a kind of cohesion can emerge from that.
And it seems this tension, this push and pull between individual and collective interests goes even deeper, down to the cellular level with cancer and even within our own genetic code with those so-called parasitic B chromosomes.
The analogy of cancer is quite powerful, isn't it? Cancer cells, they essentially go rogue, stop playing by the rules of the body, and just multiply out of control. It's like a breakdown of cooperation at the cellular level, ultimately harming the whole organism.
And those B chromosomes, they're like freeloaders in our DNA, hitching a ride and using resources without really contributing anything useful, sometimes even causing harm. It's a reminder that even at the smallest levels, there's this potential for subversion.
And it's not just passive freeloading either. We've got those segregation disorders in mice and fruit flies. These genes actively manipulate the system to ensure their own transmission to the next generation. It's like a genetic power play, even if it ends up hurting the individual carrying them.
So how does it not all just descend into complete genetic chaos? It's a good thing we have this parliament of genes concept, where selfish genes can be kept in check by others acting, well, in their own self-interest to ensure the survival of the organism.
Lee's Parliament of Genes idea is quite elegant, isn't it? It suggests that even within the genome, there's a sort of internal balance. Genes that promote cooperation or suppress overly selfish elements end up benefiting in the long run because, well, a dead organism doesn't help any of its genes.
Shifting gears a bit now. When we look at the diversity of social behaviors in the animal kingdom, it really is a spectrum, isn't it? You've got those hyper-cooperative social insects, like ants and bees, and then, well, us humans, somewhere in the middle.
The social insects are fascinating, aren't they? Their colonies function almost like single organisms, with an extreme division of labor. Many individuals even give up their own reproduction to serve the collective. It's like the beehive as a single many-tentacled creature, as our source so vividly puts it.
It makes you wonder why we haven't gone down that same evolutionary path, with specialized reproductive and non-reproductive castes. I can't imagine too many humans being thrilled with the idea of being a sterile worker bee.
It seems that our social structures have evolved under different pressures, where individual reproductive success remains a powerful driving force. And this leads us to another key element of human societies, the division of labor among specialists, each focusing on a particular skill or trade.
Ah, yes, good old Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations. He really nailed it, didn't he? The power of specialization, each person honing their skills, leading to greater efficiency, more innovation, a higher standard of living for everyone involved.
He really did. And you can see it as analogous to the specialized cells in our own bodies. Each cell has its job, contributing to the functioning of the whole.
But it's important to remember, like Samuel Britton pointed out, that pursuing self-interest through this division of labor, through trade, isn't the same thing as spite. The baker isn't baking bread out of malice toward the hungry. He's doing it to make a living.
A crucial distinction. Self-interest in this context drives a system that, while not intentionally altruistic, generates widespread benefits. It's not about actively harming others, but about focusing on one's own gain, which can often have positive ripple effects.
It's almost like our immune system, right? All those highly specialized cells, each doing their thing to target specific threats, and in the process, they protect the entire body.
A very apt analogy. Individual actions, even if seemingly self-serving at a lower level, can contribute to a larger beneficial outcome without requiring conscious altruism at every step. It's like a natural emergent order.
Which brings us to, I think, one of the most fascinating thought experiments in all of social science. The prisoner's dilemma. It really boils down that tension between individual rationality and collective good to its purest form.
And both Hobbes and Rousseau, in their own ways, were wrestling with this dilemma, weren't they? Hobbes's state of nature as a war of all against all is essentially a continuous prisoner's dilemma where the rational choice for each individual is to be aggressive, defensive, leading to a pretty miserable existence for everyone.
And Rousseau, with his stag hunt analogy, showed how even when cooperation is the best option for all involved, the temptation to defect, to grab a smaller reward for yourself, can ruin it for everyone. It's like this fundamental challenge of coordinating in a world of self-interested individuals.
And for a long time, mathematicians tried to find a purely logical way out of this dilemma, a way to prove that cooperation was always the best bet. But in a single interaction, they couldn't crack it.
Then came the computers, and those simulations that showed how cooperative strategies, like the famous tit for tat, could actually win out in repeated interactions. It's almost like the machines stumbled upon a path to cooperation that pure reason alone had missed.
Those computer tournaments, run by Robert Axelrod, were truly groundbreaking. They demonstrated that in a world where interactions aren't just one-offs, where there's a history and the potential for future encounters, cooperation based on reciprocity can be a winning strategy.
And what's so elegant about tit for tat is its simplicity. You start by cooperating. Then you just mirror your opponent's last move. Cooperate if they cooperated, defect if they defected. Nice, but retaliatory. Forgiving, but clear.
And what those simulations showed was that while purely nasty strategies could exploit the naive cooperators for a while, eventually they'd mostly end up defecting against each other, which isn't a great outcome for anyone.
So it created this opening for tit for tat to thrive. It could cooperate with others like itself, building up mutual benefit, but it could also punish defectors, preventing them from taking over.
And then there was generous tit for tat, which added little wrinkle. It would occasionally forgive a single defection, which helped it to avoid getting stuck in those endless cycles of retaliation that could sometimes trap pure tit for tat.
It's like a little bit of generosity, a little bit of trust can actually make cooperation more robust in the long run.
It's a powerful idea, isn't it? And we see hints of this kind of reciprocal behavior in the natural world, too, like those vampire bats that share blood, seeming to keep track of who's shared with them before.
And those stickleback fish, initially thought to be using tit for tat during predator inspections. Although, as our sources point out, the interpretation of their behavior has become a bit more nuanced, it still seems like some form of contingent cooperation is going on there.
Absolutely. Those examples suggest that even in the animal kingdom, there are these mechanisms for rewarding reciprocity and punishing those who consistently fail to cooperate. It's not just a human thing.
But it's important to acknowledge the potential downside of tit for tat too, right? If someone defects, even by accident, it can trigger those cycles of retaliation that are hard to break. One defection leading to another, and pretty soon, the whole cooperative relationship unravels.
That's a real danger. Tit for tat's retaliatory nature, while essential for deterring exploitation, can also be its Achilles heel. And of course, those computer simulations, while insightful, are still simplified representations of the real world.
Critics rightly point out that Axelrod's tournaments didn't capture all the messy complexities of real-life social interactions.
True, but they did do something incredibly important. They shifted the way we think about the prisoner's dilemma. It went from this zero-sum game, where one person's win is another's loss, to a non-zero-sum game where cooperation could lead to mutual benefit.
Which is a much better reflection of how many human interactions actually work, especially in things like trade. But that still leaves us with a big question. How do we explain cooperation in those large, complex societies where we don't have those repeated interactions with everyone we encounter?
That's where the idea of cultural group selection comes in. Boyd and Richardson proposed that groups with more cooperative norms and practices might simply outcompete those that are less cooperative, leading to the spread of those cultural traits over time. It's selection operating not on genes directly, but on learned behaviors and traditions.
And a key mechanism for maintaining cooperation in those large groups seems to be conformism. We tend to adopt the behaviors and beliefs of those around us, right? It's like a social glue that helps keep everyone more or less on the same page.
Conformism is incredibly powerful. It can help to spread beneficial innovations, but it can also lead to harmful behaviors or beliefs taking hold. It's a double-edged sword, that's for sure.
Which connects with that informational cascade theory, right? Where we sometimes do things just because we see others doing them, even if it goes against our own judgment. It can be efficient, leveraging the collective wisdom, but it can also lead us all down the wrong path.
Exactly. The crowd isn't always right. And this tendency toward conformism, our sources suggest, is deeply intertwined with the way we form distinct cultural groups, with all the potential for both cooperation and conflict that comes with that.
We see it in the role of music, religion, all sorts of cultural practices that help to define who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group. Religion, historically, has often drawn a pretty sharp line between believers and non-believers.
It can be a powerful force for binding people together, but it can also lead to exclusion and even hostility towards those outside the group.
And as cynical as it might sound, our sources suggest that even seemingly universal moral codes might have evolved, at least in part, because they gave groups an advantage in competition with other groups.
It's a functionalist view of morality, suggesting that behaviors that promote internal cooperation and cohesion within a group can make that group more successful in the long run, leading to those moral codes being passed down.
It's a sobering thought, but perhaps a realistic one when you consider the long sweep of human history. And while Christianity, for example, might preach universal love and brotherhood, the reality has often been quite different, with a lot of conflict and exclusion.
Indeed. The pull of group identity, the us versus them mentality, can be incredibly strong even in the face of seemingly universal ideals.
But it's not all about conflict between groups, is it? One of the upsides of this human tendency to form groups is trade. Our sources call it a beneficent side of human groupishness.
Yeah.
It's like our tribal nature actually creates opportunities for mutual benefit through exchange.
Precisely. The division of humanity into different groups, each potentially with its own specializations, creates the conditions for trade to flourish. And trade, as we know, can lead to increased wealth, innovation, and well-being for everyone involved.
It's a stark contrast to what we see in our primate relatives, like chimpanzees. Their groups are largely closed off, with violence being the main form of interaction between them, no trading of goods or sharing of ideas there.
The chimpanzee model of intergroup relations underscores a key difference in how humans have evolved to interact with each other. And what's even more interesting is that humans don't just trade essentials. We sometimes seem to invent needs or desires specifically to stimulate trade. The Yanomamo, for instance, with their elaborate rituals and gift exchanges, show how trade can be about much more than just acquiring material goods.
And the story of the Yururant tribe and the introduction of steel axes really highlights how transformative trade and specialization can be. It's a reminder that the principle of comparative advantage, the idea that everyone benefits from focusing on what they do best and then trading with others, isn't just a modern economic theory. It's something that's likely been shaping human societies for a very long time.
Absolutely. The year-year-on example shows that access to more efficient tools and technologies through trade can have a profound impact on a society's development and well-being. It's a lesson that holds true whether we're talking about ancient tribes or modern globalized economies.
And it's amazing to think that something like merchant law, those rules and customs that govern trade, emerged spontaneously
Yeah.
without any central authority dictating them. Just a shared understanding among traders that cheating and dishonesty would lead to being ostracized, excluded from future exchanges.
The development of merchant law is a testament to the power of self-organization. When people have a shared interest in facilitating trade, in creating a system where everyone can benefit, they can find ways to regulate their behavior and resolve disputes without needing a top-down authority to impose rules.
And even something as seemingly dry as the history of coins, the circulation of silver and gold during the Crusades, can reveal these fascinating patterns of trade, how they shape monetary systems, and lead to all sorts of unintended consequences. It's like a reminder that economics is never just about numbers, it's about human behavior, human choices.
The flow of precious metals during the Crusades is a great example of how seemingly distant events can be interconnected through trade and finance. It shows how actions in one part of the world can ripple out and affect economies in other parts of the world. And it highlights the distinction between mutually beneficial trade, driven by specialization and comparative advantage, and those zero-sum transactions like theft or speculation that just shuffle existing wealth around without creating anything new.
Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage really underscores that, doesn't it? Real sustainable prosperity comes from finding ways to create more value, not just grab a bigger slice of the existing pie. Which brings us to something I find particularly interesting. The idea that those ancient hunter-gatherer societies might not have been as isolated and self-sufficient as we often imagine. Our sources suggest that there might have been ancient trade networks, perhaps quite sophisticated ones, linking different groups.
That's a fascinating possibility, isn't it? It challenges the traditional view of hunter-gatherers as completely self-reliant, living in these small, isolated bands. It suggests that even in those early societies, there might have been this drive to specialize, to find ways to exchange goods and knowledge with others. And these ancient trade routes could have played a significant role in the spread of innovations and ideas, helping those early human populations to adapt and thrive.
Now, shifting to a more modern concern, the issue of environmental stewardship. There's this romantic notion, isn't there, of indigenous peoples living in perfect harmony with nature, these ecologically noble savages who only take what they need and leave no trace. But our sources paint a more complicated picture.
The idea of the ecologically noble savage is appealing, but the evidence suggests a more complex reality. We have historical events like the Pleistocene overkill, where the arrival of humans in new continents coincided with mass extinctions, suggesting that early human populations could have significant impacts on their environments. And studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies also show that they don't always practice systematic conservation.
Yeah, those examples of the Piro in Peru and the Siona sequoia in Ecuador, who, despite their deep connection to nature, didn't seem to have any widespread conservation practices, really challenge that idealized view.
Those cases suggest that conservation often arises not from some innate virtue, but as a pragmatic response to resource scarcity or other specific circumstances.
Which brings us, of course, to the tragedy of the commons. That grim idea that when resources are shared, with no clear ownership or regulation, they tend to be overexploited, even when everyone knows it's ultimately in their best interest to conserve them.
The tragedy of the commons is a classic example of individual rationality leading to collective irrationality. Each person, acting in their own self-interest, has an incentive to take as much as they can from the shared resource, leading to its depletion and ultimately harming everyone in the long run. It's a powerful illustration of why some form of regulation or property rights is often needed to manage common pool resources effectively.
But we also see examples of how those problems can be solved. Establishing clear property rights, whether individual or communal, and implementing sensible regulations can make a huge difference. The Maine lobster gangs, with their informal but effective territorial system, are a great example of how communal property rights can emerge without needing some top-down authority to impose them.
Those lobster gangs show that local communities can find ways to manage resources sustainably, using their own knowledge and social norms to enforce the rules. And sometimes, even seemingly traditional practices, like those incredibly sophisticated irrigation systems in Nepal and Bali, can embody a deep ecological wisdom that's far more effective than any top-down government intervention.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the best solutions come from the people who are closest to the problem, the people who have the most intimate knowledge of the local ecology and the needs of the community.
It's about recognizing the value of local knowledge, of community-based solutions, and not assuming that top-down approaches are always the best way to manage complex systems.
All of this discussion keeps circling back to that age-old question. What is human nature really like? Are we, at our core, good but corrupted by society, like Rousseau believed? Or are we inherently selfish, requiring the constraints of civilization to keep us in check, as Hobbes argued?
That debate about the perfectibility of man has been raging for centuries, hasn't it? It's a fundamental question that shapes our understanding of how societies work, of what kind of political systems we should build.
Huxley, who was a big proponent of Darwin, seemed to lean towards Hobbes' view, describing primitive life as this brutal struggle for existence. Not exactly a heartwarming picture of our natural state.
Huxley, influenced by the Darwinian focus on competition and survival of the fittest, did take a rather grim view of early human life. But it's important to remember that the picture we have of those early societies is constantly evolving as new evidence emerges. And Rousseau's idea of the noble savage, the idea that humans are inherently good but corrupted by civilization, well, that took a bit of a hit with the less than idyllic realities uncovered during those early voyages to the South Pacific.
Right, those romanticized accounts of places like Tahiti where everyone lived in harmony and free love reigned turned out to be a bit of an exaggeration. Real life, even in those seemingly idyllic societies, was more complicated, with its share of conflict, hierarchy, and less than noble behaviors. And then there's Margaret Mead, who argued that culture was the dominant force shaping human behavior, that we were essentially blank slates at birth, shaped by our environment.
Mead's work on cultural determinism was incredibly influential, emphasizing the power of learned behaviors and social norms in shaping who we are. But her findings, particularly her work on Samoa, were later challenged by Derek Freeman, who argued that she had overlooked or downplayed evidence of aggression, competition, and other behaviors that suggested a more universal human nature.
So we're back to that nature versus nurture debate, aren't we? How much of who we are is determined by our genes, our biology, and how much is shaped by our environment, our culture? It's a question that continues to fascinate and frustrate scientists and philosophers alike.
It's a complex interplay, isn't it? We're not simply blank slates, shaped solely by our experiences, but neither are we simply robots programmed by our genes. There's this constant interaction between our biology and our environment, this back and forth that shapes who we are as individuals and as societies.
And sometimes this whole debate can lead to a sort of reverse naturalistic fallacy, right? This idea that if something is natural, it must be good, and therefore anything unnatural, anything created by human intervention, must be bad. It's like a knee-jerk reaction against anything that smacks of artificiality.
The reverse naturalistic fallacy is a dangerous trap to fall into. It leads to this rejection of anything that doesn't fit into some idealized notion of a pristine natural state. It ignores the fact that humans are part of nature, that our capacity for innovation and creativity is itself a product of natural selection, and it can lead to a rejection of technologies or interventions that could actually improve our lives and the health of the planet.
And the history of attempts to create a new man, a perfectly rational, selfless, and harmonious being through social engineering or ideological indoctrination, well, that hasn't exactly been a resounding success, has it?
Those experiments in social engineering, whether driven by utopian ideals or totalitarian ideologies, often ended in disaster. They failed to recognize the complexity of human nature, the persistence of individual motivations and desires. It's a reminder that trying to force people into some predetermined mold often backfires, leading to unintended consequences and often, tragically, to oppression and suffering.
And it seems that excessive government intervention, even when well-intentioned, can sometimes backfire, undermining those very community bonds and social norms that foster cooperation and altruism. Our sources cite examples from Italy and Britain, where welfare programs, while aimed at helping the poor, might have actually eroded social capital and increased dependence on the state.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it? It suggests that well-intentioned policies can sometimes have unintended negative consequences, especially if they fail to take into account the complex web of social norms, incentives, and motivations that shape human behavior. And it highlights the importance of finding ways to empower communities to solve their own problems, rather than always relying on top-down solutions.
So where does all this leave us? It seems like we've explored this intricate dance between cooperation and self-interest, this tension between individual desires and the needs of the collective. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to examine: the role of emotions in all of this.
Emotions are often seen as irrational, as interfering with clear thinking and decision-making. But as we delve into the work of thinkers like Mandeville and Frank, we'll see that emotions might actually play a crucial role in solving those cooperation problems that pure logic alone can't seem to crack.
Mandeville, with his Fable of the Bees, put forward this rather provocative idea that private vices could actually lead to public benefits. That those very things we often consider selfish or even immoral, like the pursuit of luxury or status, can drive economic activity and social progress. It's like a counterintuitive argument for the power of self-interest.
Mandeville's work was controversial in its time, but it challenged conventional morality and forced people to think about the unintended consequences of individual actions. And Robert Frank, building on this idea, proposed that emotions, those seemingly irrational impulses, can actually serve as commitment devices, helping us to cooperate in situations where pure logic would dictate defection.
It's like a way of signaling our intentions, of making credible commitments that go beyond just calculating costs and benefits in the moment. Frank uses the example of friends starting a restaurant together. Purely rationally, each friend might be tempted to shirk their responsibilities, to let the others do the hard work. But emotions like guilt and shame, the fear of damaging the friendship, can actually keep them in line, motivate them to contribute their fair share.
It's like those emotions create a kind of social bond, a sense of obligation that goes beyond just the immediate calculation of self-interest. And Frank also gives the example of a farmer who wants to deter cattle from trespassing on his land. He could put up a fence, but that's costly. Instead, he puts up a sign that says, "Beware of bull." Now, rationally, a cow shouldn't be deterred by a sign, but the sign triggers an emotional response, a fear of potential danger that's much more effective than any purely rational argument.
So emotions, in a way, can make us more predictable, more trustworthy. They allow others to anticipate our behavior, to believe that we'll keep our promises, even when it might be tempting to break them.
Precisely. And we see this in the ultimatum game, a classic experiment in behavioral economics. One person gets to propose how to split a sum of money, and the other person can either accept or reject the offer. Now, rationally, the second person should accept any offer, even a tiny one, because something is better than nothing.
But that's not what happens in the real world, is it? People routinely reject unfair offers, even if it means they get nothing. It's like we have this built-in sense of fairness, this aversion to being treated unfairly.
And Vernon Smith, who did some fascinating variations of the ultimatum game, suggested that it's not so much about fairness per se, but about reciprocity. We're willing to punish those who treat us unfairly, even if it costs us something, because we expect others to reciprocate that behavior in the future. It's like a way of establishing a reputation for not being a pushover, for not tolerating exploitation.
And this sense of reciprocity, this concern for fairness, seems to be pretty deeply ingrained in us, even in young children. It's not just a product of culture or social conditioning. It seems to be part of our evolved psychology.
Jerome Kagan, a prominent developmental psychologist, argued that the capacity for guilt, that feeling of remorse when we've wronged someone, is a human universal, a foundation of our moral sense. And those feelings of guilt, along with other emotions like shame, empathy, and compassion, play a crucial role in shaping our social interactions, in motivating us to act in ways that benefit others, even when it might not be in our immediate self-interest.
So it's not about suppressing or denying those self-interested impulses, but about recognizing the power of emotions to guide our behavior, to help us navigate the complexities of social life. It's like that old children's rhyme, right? What are little boys made of? Snips and snails and puppy dog tails. What are little girls made of? Sugar and spice and all things nice.
And that last line about all things nice, that's what we might call grace. It's not about some heroic struggle to overcome our baser instincts. It's about recognizing that we are capable of kindness, compassion, and cooperation as part of our very nature.
And perhaps, instead of trying to design systems that assume we're perfectly rational, self-interested calculators, we should be thinking about how to design systems that harness those nicer aspects of our nature, those emotions that can drive us towards cooperation and mutual benefit.
That's a powerful idea. It's about creating institutions and social norms that encourage those pro-social emotions, that make it easier for us to trust each other, to cooperate, and to build a more just and harmonious society. It's not about denying our self-interest, but about recognizing that it's not the only force at play in human affairs.
Now, we focused a lot on cooperation within groups, but what about the dynamics between groups? We've seen how our tendency to form groups can lead to both trade and conflict, but what are the deeper evolutionary roots of those intergroup dynamics? Our sources suggest that we can learn a lot by looking at our primate cousins, particularly baboons and chimpanzees.
Primates, especially those living in complex social groups, offer fascinating insights into the interplay of cooperation and competition. Baboons, for instance, form coalitions to compete for resources and mates. It's like a preview of the kinds of alliances and rivalries that we see play out on a grander scale in human societies.
But it's important to remember that we're not just scaled-up baboons, right? We've evolved our own unique set of social behaviors and cognitive abilities.
Absolutely. We share common ancestry with other primates, but we've also diverged in significant ways. And chimpanzees, in particular, provide some intriguing parallels to human behavior. Frans de Waal, who studied chimpanzees at the Arnhem Zoo, observed how they formed coalitions to manipulate the social hierarchy within the group. It's like they were engaging in political maneuvering, using alliances to gain power and influence.
It sounds almost Machiavellian, doesn't it?
Yeah.
These seemingly supportive behaviors actually masking a strategic game of social chess.
And what's even more fascinating is that these chimpanzee coalitions are primarily focused on within-group dynamics. When it comes to interactions between groups, chimpanzees tend to be much more aggressive and territorial. Their encounters with rival groups often involve violent clashes, with little evidence of the kind of peaceful exchange or trade that we see in humans.
It's like they have this strong us versus them mentality, but it's limited to those within group power struggles. They haven't figured out how to harness that groupishness for mutually beneficial interactions with outsiders.
And that's one of the key differences between humans and chimpanzees. We've managed to combine that chimpanzee-like xenophobia, that tendency to see outsiders as threats, with the capacity for forming complex alliances and engaging in trade that extends beyond our immediate group.
It's like we've taken those basic primate impulses of cooperation and competition and scaled them up to a whole new level.
And this brings us to the concept of fraternal interest groups, those groups of related males who cooperate to defend territory and resources. The patterns of male residence and female migration in human societies seem to have played a key role in shaping these intergroup dynamics, often leading to increased antagonism between groups.
And history is full of examples of this kind of intergroup conflict, isn't it? The Nika riots in Constantinople, for instance, sparked by rival factions of chariot racing enthusiasts, show how even something as seemingly trivial as a sporting event can become a flashpoint for violence when it taps into those deeper tribal loyalties.
The Nika riots are a stark reminder of how easily those groupish impulses can be ignited, leading to chaos and destruction. And we see similar patterns in the animal kingdom, too. Ant colonies, for example, often engage in fierce competition with neighboring colonies, with individual queens even cooperating to establish a new colony, only for that cooperation to break down once the intergroup competition is over.
It's like cooperation is often a means to an end, a way to gain an advantage over rivals. But once that external threat is removed, the individual self-interest reasserts itself.
It's a reminder that cooperation is not always driven by some inherent altruism or a desire for harmony. It can be a strategic tool, a way to outcompete rivals in a struggle for resources or dominance.
And this brings us to the debate about group selection, the idea that natural selection can act not just on individuals, but on entire groups, favoring those groups that are more cooperative or altruistic. V.C. Wynne Edwards, for instance, argued that certain bird species, like rooks, would limit their breeding for the good of the population, preventing overexploitation of resources.
When Edwards' theory of group selection was controversial, and David Lack, another prominent biologist, offered a compelling counter-argument. Lack argued that individual selection was generally a stronger force, that any individual who deviated from the group's restraint on breeding would likely gain a reproductive advantage, even if it ultimately harmed the group as a whole. He called these individuals selfish mutineers.
So it's like there's always this potential for those who are willing to break the rules, to exploit the cooperation of others, to gain an advantage. It's a reminder that even in seemingly tightly knit groups, the temptation to defect, to put one's own interests above the collective good, is always present.
That's why group selection is generally considered a weaker force than individual selection, particularly in the animal kingdom. Cooperation tends to be strongest among close relatives, where there's a shared genetic